The American patrol came to the barn expecting rifles. They found Red Cross armbands. 36 German nurses stood in the straw, their hands raised so slowly it looked painful. Their white uniforms were no longer white. Their aprons were gray with mud, stiff with old blood, and torn at the hems from weeks of walking. The youngest one stepped forward first. Her lips were split. Her face had the empty look of someone who had gone too long without sleep, food, or hope. And in broken English she whispered, "Please, let it end. Not, don't shoot, not, we surrender, let it end." For a moment the American soldiers did not understand what she meant. Then they looked at the women more closely. The shaking hands, the infected feet, the hollow cheeks, the way some of them kept their eyes on the rifles, as if the rifles might finally do what exhaustion had not. These were not soldiers hiding behind nurse uniforms. They were medical workers who had been dragged to the edge of collapse by a war that was already dying around them. And what the Americans did next broke through years of fear, propaganda, and hatred in a way no battlefield speech ever could. By the first days of April 1945, Germany was no longer a front line, it was a wound. American armored columns were cutting through towns faster than German command posts could read their maps. Roads that had once carried divisions now carried stragglers, refugees, broken horses, and carts loaded with the wounded. Field hospitals were ordered to move, then ordered to stay, then ordered to move again, even when there was no fuel left to move anything. Behind the collapsing army came the people history usually forgets: nurses, orderlies, stretcher bearers, doctors with no anesthetic, women carrying bandages in coat pockets because the supply crates had disappeared days earlier. One of those groups had started the month at a converted schoolhouse hospital east of Fulda. It had once been neat, disciplined, and overfilled. By April, it had become a place where the floor was full before the beds were, and the hallway smelled of boiled linen, infection, and smoke from the town burning outside. The nurses there had been told to evacuate before dawn. There were more than 200 wounded men. There were 9 vehicles. Only 4 could still run. That was the mathematics of a collapsing army. The head nurse, Marta Weiss, counted what could be carried. Surgical clamps, a few rolls of gauze, 2 bottles of iodine, a tin box of sulfa powder, 6 morphine syrettes that the doctor made her hide under the lining of her coat. Everything else had to be left behind. The men on the floor knew what that meant. Some grabbed at the nurse's sleeves. Some begged not to be moved, some begged not to be left, and for the first time in her life, Marta did something that felt worse than failure. She chose. The men who could sit were loaded first. The men who could walk were told to walk. The men who could not be moved were given water, a clean bandage if one could be found, and a lie. "We will come back." Nobody believed it. For 12 days, the nurses moved west along farm roads, orchards, and drainage ditches, staying away from the main highways because American aircraft owned the sky. They no longer looked like a medical unit. They looked like ghosts trying to remember their duties. They slept in barns when farmers allowed it, in ditches when they did not. Rain soaked their wool coats until they rubbed the skin raw at the shoulders. Their shoes split at the soles. Some wrapped their feet in torn apron cloth. One nurse tied cardboard inside her boot and walked until the cardboard turned to paste. Every village had more wounded, a boy with shrapnel in his neck, an old reservist coughing blood into his hands, a tank crewman burned so badly the nurses could not tell where his uniform ended and his skin began. They had almost nothing left, so they cleaned wounds with stream water. They tore petticoats into strips. They traded a wedding ring for a loaf of black bread. They cut 1 morphine dose into 3 smaller acts of mercy and still hated themselves for the 2 men who received none. The war had trained them to save bodies. Now it was teaching them how many bodies could not be saved. By the 8th day, hunger became quieter. That frightened them most. At first, hunger had been pain. Then it became dizziness. Then it became a strange calm that made the young nurses stare at puddles as if the water were a meal. One woman began speaking to her mother, who had been dead for 3 years. Another kept folding and refolding the same strip of bandage until her fingers bled. A third carried a little notebook of patient names, even though almost every name in it now belonged to a man she would never see again. Marta ordered them to throw away anything that was not medical. Extra dresses, books, a cracked mirror, photographs. But nobody threw away food, even the idea of food. One nurse carried 3 raw potatoes in her pocket for 2 days, too afraid to eat them because after they were gone, there would be nothing left to imagine. On the morning of April 15, they heard American guns, not close enough to see, close enough to feel in the ribs. The sound was different from German artillery, slower, heavier, confident. By afternoon, the roads behind them were filling with men moving in no formation at all. Some had rifles, some had only blankets. A corporal with 1 boot told them the Americans were less than 10 miles west. A civilian shouted that the Soviets were coming from the east. Another man said British tanks had already crossed the next river. Every direction sounded like death. That evening, the nurses found an abandoned aid post inside a church sacristy. The candles were gone. The altar cloth had been cut into bandages. 5 wounded soldiers lay on the floor with a medical orderly who had not slept in 2 days. He looked at Marta's Red Cross armband and laughed once. Not because anything was funny, because the sight of medical help arriving with empty hands was too cruel to understand. "Do you have morphine?" he asked. Marta did not answer. He nodded as if she had. The nurses worked anyway. They cleaned what they could. They changed dressings that should have been changed a week earlier. One of the youngest nurses, Elise, held a dying man's hand while he asked whether the war had reached his village yet. She told him no. She had no idea. At dawn, the man was dead. Elise sat beside him for almost an hour, still holding his hand, because letting go felt like admitting she had lied to him for nothing. That was the morning something in the group changed. They stopped talking about where to go. They talked only about when it would stop. Marta gathered them near the church door and made the decision nobody wanted to make out loud. They would continue west, toward the Americans. Not because they trusted them, because the alternative was walking deeper into chaos, with no food, no supplies, and no strength left to pretend discipline could save them. All their lives, they had been told what the enemy would do. The enemy would punish them. The enemy would humiliate them. The enemy would see no difference between a nurse and a soldier. And now, after years of hearing that, they were going to test it with their own bodies. The dairy barn stood on a low hill outside a village whose name none of them remembered afterward. Its roof sagged, its doors would not close. Inside, the hay was damp, but it blocked the wind. 36 nurses lay down without taking off their coats. No one slept. Through the gaps in the boards, they watched headlights move along the road below. Not German blackout lamps, American vehicles. Jeeps, trucks, half-tracks, all moving with a steadiness that felt obscene after weeks of German disorder. The women huddled closer. One whispered a prayer. Another kissed the Red Cross pin on her collar. Elise, the youngest, asked Marta what they should say if the Americans. Marta answered, "We say we are medical personnel." Elise asked, "And if they do not believe us?" Marta had no answer for that. Just before sunrise, the engines stopped. Voices came up the hill, English voices. A dog barked somewhere in the village, then went silent. The barn door creaked open before Marta could reach it. American soldiers stood outside in the gray light, rifles raised, helmets wet with morning rain. For one frozen second, nobody moved. The Americans saw uniforms. The nurses saw rifles. The whole war seemed to hold its breath in the doorway. Marta lifted both hands. "We are nurses," she said in English. "Red Cross, we surrender." The others came out behind her in a slow line. That was when Elise stepped forward. She was 19, maybe 20. Later, none of the Americans could agree. She looked younger than all of them. She raised her hands, but her arms were shaking so badly they would not stay up, and then she said it. "Please, let it end." The American sergeant lowered his rifle a few inches. Not all the way, just enough to show that something had changed. He looked past Elise at the women behind her. One had collapsed to her knees. One was trying to stand on feet that had swollen out of her shoes. Another kept saying "bit" over and over, the word breaking smaller each time. The sergeant turned to his medic. "Doc," he said quietly, "get up here." The medic came forward with his own Red Cross armband visible on his sleeve. He moved slowly, palms open as if approaching a frightened animal. "Anybody hurt?" he asked. No one answered. He tried again, softer. "Anyone need a doctor?" Marta stared at him. This was the moment she had prepared herself for, and it did not match the shape of her fear. No shouting, no kicks, no hands tearing away armbands, no punishment for the uniform she wore. Just a tired American medic looking at 36 starving women and asking who needed help first. Then he offered Elise his canteen. She did not take it. She looked at Marta, waiting for permission like a child. Marta nodded. Elise drank one mouthful, then stopped, because she had forgotten how to believe there could be more. The medic gently pushed the canteen back toward her. "Slow," he said. "But drink." That single word did more damage to the propaganda in their heads than any argument could have. Drink, not confess, not march, not kneel. Drink. Within minutes a field truck arrived, then another. The Americans separated no one. They took no jewelry. They did not mock the torn uniforms or the swollen feet. They wrapped 2 nurses in blankets before loading them into the back because they were shivering too hard to climb. The women still did not understand. Fear does not vanish the moment danger passes. Sometimes fear keeps living in the body long after the body has been saved. At the American aid station, the nurses were brought into a village schoolhouse. Its classrooms had become treatment rooms. Desks were pushed against the walls. Cots stood in straight lines. On one table lay things the German nurses had not seen in months. Sterile gauze, fresh bandages, surgical gloves, penicillin, morphine syringes still sealed in paper, clean instruments shining under lamplight. One nurse stopped walking when she saw them. She whispered, "They have enough." An American doctor thought she meant there were enough beds. She did not. She meant enough to throw something away after using it once. Enough to treat pain before it became screaming. Enough to clean a wound without pretending dirty water was medicine. Enough that a nurse did not have to choose which man suffered because the last ampule was already gone. For Marta, that table of supplies was not abundance. It was an autopsy of every lie Germany had told itself. How could a nation with empty hospitals defeat a nation whose medics carried more medicine in one truck than her whole ward had seen in a month? The doctor examined them one by one. Most were dangerously thin. A dozen had infected blisters. Several had fever. 2 could not stand without help. All of them had the same flat stare the Americans had seen before in liberated prisoners, bombed-out civilians, and soldiers who had been too close to death for too long. The doctor ordered food, not heavy rations. Soup first, bread in small pieces, water slowly. When the bowls arrived, the smell filled the room before the nurses saw them. Potatoes, meat broth, carrots, nothing special to an army kitchen. A miracle to women who had been chewing raw turnips and calling it survival. Still, some would not eat. Elise held her spoon but did not lift it. Marta saw 2 nurses slip bread into their coat pockets. Another tucked half a crust under a blanket. It was not greed, it was terror. Their bodies had learned that every meal might be the last. An American nurse noticed. She knelt beside one of them and spoke through a translator. "You do not have to hide it." The German nurse froze. The American nurse pointed to the doorway where another pot was being carried in. "There is more. There is more." 3 words. Enough to break them. One nurse began sobbing so hard she could not swallow. Another covered her face with both hands, ashamed of how badly she wanted the food. Marta sat with the bowl in her lap and felt the heat rise through the metal, into her fingers, into a part of her that had gone numb days earlier. She had expected judgment. She had expected revenge. Instead, the enemy had given them soup and told them there was more. Later that afternoon, a translator asked for their names, their medical unit, their last station, and whether any of them had witnessed crimes by German troops. The questions were firm, but they were questions, not beatings. The women were listed as medical personnel, not combat prisoners. Their armbands were noted, their wounds were treated, and by evening, several of the German nurses were helping change dressings in the American aid station. That surprised the Americans. It should not have. These women were exhausted, frightened, and half-starved. But they were still nurses. They knew how to hold a wounded man's shoulder before the bandage came free. They knew how to clean without wasting supplies. They knew when a soldier was brave and when he was only trying not to cry. They knew that pain had no nationality once the blood was on the floor. One American medic watched Marta tie a dressing around a shattered forearm with practiced speed. He said, "You have done this before." Marta looked at him, too tired to soften the answer. "Too many times." For 3 days the nurses remained under American care. They slept on cots and woke in panic because no one had shouted evacuation orders. They washed their hands with real soap. They received clean socks. Their fevers dropped. Their faces slowly began to look like faces again, not masks cut from hunger. And the strangest thing happened. The Americans became less like the monsters they had been warned about. Not saints, not friends, not yet. Just men and women doing a job with discipline. The German nurses became less like symbols of the enemy, not innocent of the world that had brought them there, not free from the questions Germany would soon have to answer, just sick human beings in need of care. That is the part war propaganda cannot survive. Not argument, contact, a canteen offered with no speech, a blanket placed around shaking shoulders, a doctor saying, "Soup first, their stomachs cannot take more," a nurse saying, "There is more," to someone who had forgotten what enough felt like. When the 36 German nurses were transferred to a larger holding hospital, they did not march there under terror. They rode in trucks. Some were questioned again. Some were released weeks later. Some returned home to find their streets gone, their family scattered, their country unrecognizable. A few went back to nursing because it was the only work that still made sense. None of them forgot the barn. Not because it was the worst moment, because it was the moment the story changed. They had entered that doorway believing surrender might be the final humiliation. Instead, it became the first hour in weeks when survival did not require pretending they were stronger than they were. The Geneva Convention required medical personnel to be treated humanely, but a rule written on paper does not pour water into a canteen. It does not notice a woman hiding bread because starvation has trained her to fear tomorrow. It does not lower a rifle when fear says to keep it raised. People do that. Tired soldiers do that. Field medics do that. Nurses who recognize other nurses do that. And in a war that had taught millions to see uniforms before faces, a few Americans looked at the women in front of them and saw the face first. The nurses had asked the enemy to end their suffering. He did, not with a rifle, but with a canteen, a blanket, and a bowl of soup.